Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy of Illinois is a member of the House Intelligence Committee. He joins me now. Congressman, talk to me about that. I'm sure you have your reasons for this in Intel, but we have had hearings. There are a lot of Americans who listened to those hearings. 70+ million listened to those hearings. They came away with conclusions. The needle was not substantially moved as a result of them. Last night, the Republicans put out a set of statements about the inquiry so far that were meant to say that no wrongdoing, never mind impeachable wrongdoing, but no wrongdoing was undertaken by the president. And then you drop this report that has things like call records and details that did not come out in the hearings that make for some very, very, very interesting reading and fact-finding. Tell me what the thinking is about not having this come out before today.
Well, I think that, first of all, I like works of fiction like anybody else, but that Republican report was ridiculous, Ali. And I think that it completely mischaracterizes what happened or what we even heard or what the American people saw for themselves from the witnesses. But going to your question, I think that this type of a report allows for this type of detail to be presented in its full context. And I think that's part of the reason why a lot of this extra detail is added. As you know, this has been a process. We went from the call transcript, which in itself I believe was very problematic, to admissions by Mick Mulvaney at press conferences that there was a quid pro quo, to deposition transcripts, which we all saw, to live testimony, and now we have this report, which has even more detail. And so I think that as we come across more information, as Adam Schiff just relayed, I'm sure that there might be supplemental reports as necessary, but this is what we have right now, and we want to get it out ASAP.
You mentioned, and the chairman was asked about people who have not testified. The report lists a number of people who were whose testimony was sought: Mick Mulvaney, Robert Blair, who is an assistant to the president, an advisor to the chief of staff, Ambassador John Bolton. We're unclear as to what happens with Bolton. John Eisenberg, deputy counsel to the president for national security. It's a long list, but there are things that came out here. There is a reference to phone calls, in particular on August 8th, which was a remarkably busy day for Rudy Giuliani and others. There was a call from a phone that is known, the number is known to be connected to the Office of Management and Budget that was involved in withholding this congressionally approved aid to Rudy Giuliani. It was a 13-minute long call. There were 5 calls from Rudy Giuliani to the White House Situation Room. Then there were texts from Kurt Volker, and then that night there were a lot more calls from Rudy Giuliani to the White House switchboard and the Situation Room. There's a lot connecting Rudy Giuliani to the Office of Management and Budget, which is inexplicable to most Americans. There'd be zero reason that they could think of why Rudy Giuliani would be needing to make those kinds of phone calls. There are calls between Devin Nunes. Adam Schiff declined to talk about that, but Devin Nunes and Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman. There's a lot of people who claim not to have much to do with each other who, in your report, seem to have a lot of communication with each other.
Well, that's exactly right. And, Rudy Giuliani, just centering on him for one moment, he basically was the head of this shadow foreign policy that we talked about during the hearings and we questioned witnesses about. Ambassador Yovanovitch was basically recalled for the purpose of having Rudy Giuliani and the three amigos lead this foreign policy, and they had broad sway with regard to what they could do in Ukraine regarding our foreign policy there. But here's the part that's really insidious, Ali, which is that they were not operating our foreign policy for the benefit of America, but they were doing it for the purpose of their clients, namely Donald J. Trump and his political motives, but also potentially other international clients of Rudy Giuliani. Whether it's Lev Parnas or Igor Fruman, or he has an associate named Dmitry Firtash, who's been indicted in my hometown of Chicago. And so this is the type of problem that you see when our foreign policy gets commandeered for other purposes. And that's why this whole series of incidents and this wrongdoing is so serious.
Testimony from Marie Yovanovitch, from Bill Taylor, from Fiona Hill, and others who would know because they worked in that world of foreign policy, testified that Rudy Giuliani had undue influence. They talked about what happened with Gordon Sondland. They talked about John Bolton saying that Rudy Giuliani's cooking up something. It's clear that the people who would think that there's somebody in their space who's exercising influence over the president in foreign policy, to them it represented a shadow foreign policy mechanism or structure. The Republican response that you and I talked about briefly that came out last night finds that didn't exist, and that there was, again, no wrongdoing by anybody, but that such a thing didn't exist. If you put everything aside, there is a valid question as to what Rudy Giuliani is doing in the middle of all of this.
That's exactly right. And I think that what Rudy Giuliani appears to be doing is basically serving as the president's point man for all of his personal agenda items. And basically, as Ambassador Sondland said, it was explicitly told to the three amigos and everybody in the Oval Office on May 23rd. That's after everybody returned from the Zelensky inaugural to report back to Donald Trump on Ukraine, that they need to talk to Rudy about next steps in Ukraine foreign policy. And Donald Trump would not go into details about why or what Rudy exactly wanted, but it was clear to Sondland that President Trump wanted them to report to Rudy, and Rudy was going to report to Trump as to what Rudy needs to convey to everyone else. And that's why this quid pro quo, as Ambassador Sondland said, was so clear to everybody, and he said everyone was in on it. Everyone was in on it.
Roger Krishnamoorth is a congressman from Illinois. He's a member of the Intelligence Committee. Congressman Krishnamoorth, good to see you. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Ali.